Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about Victims' Rights Week. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Meg Garvin. Meg uses she, her pronouns and is the executive director of the National Crime Victim Law Institute, which is based at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, where she is also a law professor. Since 2003, Meg has been working in the field of victims' rights, drafting legislation, litigating the meaning of rights, and educating attorneys, advocates, law enforcement, victims, and more on the importance of these rights. So Meg, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited for the conversation.
And I also have Jennifer Dritt. Jen uses she, her pronouns and is the executive director from the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. She has been involved in the movement to end sexual violence for over 35 years, initially as an advocate and trauma therapist, and more recently as an administrator and policymaker. So Jen, thank you so much as well for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Emilie. I'm really pleased to be here.
I'm really excited to have this super important conversation. And as a brief introduction, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is a time to uplift and highlight this issue and talk about ways we can support survivors and end sexual violence. So during this month, we will be releasing podcasts highlighting voices of survivors and their healing journeys, as well as advocating for victims' rights and ways we can all do our part in preventing violence. So this podcast is set to come out during Victims' Rights Week, which is a time to uplift and highlight the effect victimization can have on individuals and promote the important policies, laws, and resources available for survivors. So today, we will be discussing what rights victims have, some common misconceptions regarding these rights, and what we could all be doing better as a society for survivors of trauma. So to start off, I like to start my podcast, as everyone who's probably listened to many episodes knows at this point, off with definitions. So with that, what exactly are victims' rights?
Victims' rights at their most basic level, right? So for all of us to really understand, the starting point of victims' rights is they're human rights, right? They're about being treated with dignity and respect by anyone engaging with you after you've been victimized. Then there's what are victims' rights kind of specifically? And those are laws that have been passed starting way back in the 1970s, really, to afford victims specific roles and protections as they navigate systems after they've been harmed, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's a housing system, whether it's employment law. Victims' rights are really laws that have been put in place to ensure certain treatment of victims after they've been harmed by crime.
That is a wonderful definition. Jen, did you want to add to it?
No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, they're human rights and then very specific laws that relate to the rights of survived victims have after victimization. And they they cross a number of arenas: housing, education, public benefits, And those are just a few. Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my other question. I think a lot of times when we think of victims' rights, we think of it just within a court context. So are they only tied to rights within a court of law?
I always end up having to say this when I'm on calls with attorneys or in meetings with attorneys. I'm not an attorney. So I'm going to say no, and then undoubtedly I'm going to get corrected about something, but no, they're not. Victims have rights within a court of law, and certainly Meg is much more qualified to speak to that than I am. But they also have rights related to access to services. They have rights related to, and I have a whole list of the rights that people have in Florida related to how they access the services, to who they can have present with them when they're engaging in certain, when they're accessing those services, what rights they have in an educational system. Lots of rights that have absolutely nothing to do with courts of law.
And I actually will echo Jen that I won't disagree. I totally agree with that. Rights are part of our contract with government. Right. So you live in a society and rights are part of the contract with government. And so they're rights in systems. Generally speaking, rights are about how you're treated in different systems. So that could be court of law. Mm-hmm. It could be the school that you're at, public education. It could be housing, right? So when you think about rights, particularly civil rights, right? There's a difference between human rights are just because you're a human. Civil rights are what's part of my contract with the government about how I'm going to be treated in the system. And so any system we're navigating, survivors will have rights because they've been victimized. And so you just have to find which rights attach to which system.
Right. And so many people, including survivors, have absolutely no idea what their rights are within either the criminal justice system or without the criminal justice system. And they have many.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point, is that I think we're not very aware of the rights that we have after a crime occurs. As a victim, what rights do we have? So what exactly is Victims' Rights Week and why do we have it?
So I can jump in first. And Victims' Rights Week, in large part, was started because of rights in the criminal justice system, right? The history of Victims' Rights Week, it started in 1981. And it was launched in large part because there was a focus on how are individual human beings being treated in criminal justice, and a recognition that they being victims, were not being afforded dignified treatment during criminal justice. It has wonderfully evolved to recognize rights in criminal justice as well as other victims' rights. And the point of the week is to kind of hit pause on like the noise of talking about criminal justice generally, and to focus on survivor treatment in systems, and then to honor survivor voices and really to recognize service providers for the work they do on a daily basis.
Right. The typical Victims' Rights Week celebration in Tallahassee, the one that is sponsored and hosted by the Office of the Attorney General every year, always features a survivor of some sort of typically interpersonal violence, and then recognizes law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and others who have really gone. It's interesting and appropriately so called above and beyond in responding to the needs of survivors, but which, interestingly enough, is really what people do every day when they work with survivors, which is do the extraordinary. And it's a really it's a short but delightful and heartfelt and meaningful celebration for people who are watching it and the people who receive the awards.
I love that. I think that's so beautifully put, and just want to uplift and thank everyone who does help and support survivors, including you both. So thank you so much for all that you both do. And then for everyone who is a service provider and supporting survivors, you really are making the difference. Meg, when we were planning this podcast, you mentioned that if you ask someone to recite their Miranda rights, they can. But when asked what their rights are as a victim of a crime, people cannot answer. So why do you think that this is?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. And I think it's true across the entire country. No matter where you go, that's going to be true. And, there's kind of a glib answer, a short answer, and that is, oh, television, right? But that's not a glib answer. Actually, that is actually answer, right? So you can ask folks like, how did you first learn your Miranda rights too? Like the right to remain silent. And it actually can be a little bit of an age test, right? Was it Dragnet? Was it Law and Order SVU, right? Like where are we in our age continuum? But what's really interesting is if you think about it, the way rights make it into popular culture, the way we start to understand our rights is because someone had to ask for the rights. Miranda was a person. Miranda was a person whose rights were violated. And he had to have a lawyer and an advocate stand next to him, right, and fight for better treatment all the way through the Arizona courts, all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And then we got the Miranda decision that told us, how do we treat people better when they are accused of a crime? And then it makes its way into popular culture because, right, drama is built around when people goof up, right? And so, right, we get Law and Order SVU, or we get, Law and Order generally, or we get Dragnet, or we get Barney Miller. That's one of the ones I used to watch, right? And so we, as popular culture starts to push out our rights, we all start to know them, right? Cops, right? The TV show Cops, we all start to know our rights. We have not had victims' rights reach that level yet because not enough people know their rights. So not enough people ask for their rights. So we haven't had a moment where courts have had to decide the rights. And so we haven't been able to have a meaningful popular culture conversation about rights. Instead, we every now and then have a one-off moment in popular culture. And truthfully, that usually gets it wrong. So I think what we need is much more of a know your rights campaign out there to affirmatively push these. We don't have to wait for that Miranda case for victims. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I want a Miranda case for victims. I mean, I want a big precedent moment for victims where we know what the rights mean, but we can't wait for it. So I think we need a know your rights campaign.
We've seen that a little bit with Know Your Nine, the movement and the organization that really pushed brought a lot of attention to the rights that students in higher education have around Title IX. And that's an example of that, though really often things change when there's a lawsuit, And so that I'm sure that's what you're thinking of. And I can think of a few times when, we get attorneys who shall remain nameless say, really, can we sue on this? Please, can we sue on this? And it's always about victims' rights for us. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that I couldn't agree more. The way I've learned about my rights is definitely through pop culture. And I think the Know Your Rights campaign is super important. And I wanted to kind of lean in on specifically sexual violence. So do you think that there's even less knowledge about one's rights when it comes to being a victim of sexual violence or sexual assault?
I think there's less knowledge. And I think it's because, victims of sexual violence experience a lot of self-blame and denial. And really, when you look at, there's been no statistically significant increase in reporting of sexual violence to law enforcement in the last 30 years. Not a statistically significant increase. And the reasons that people gave for not reporting to law enforcement when in the National Women's Study replicated were the same reasons they gave in the National Women's Study 25 years before that, which is that fear of being blamed, fear of not being believed, fear of having their private life splashed all over, media. None of the reasons had changed. They were exactly the same. And so, and additionally, what we do know is that many attorneys and judges aren't aware of or have a deep understanding of the rights available to victims of sexual violence. So it makes sense that victims themselves would not know.
And I would love to, I completely agree with Jen, like there is an additional lack of awareness of rights. And I'm going to add to that, I think, too, which is sexual violence has a long legacy of poor treatment in the system. So even if you know you have a right, the way that sexual violence survivors have been treated by systems has resulted in many of them saying, my rights aren't strong enough. I don't have enough support behind me. And I'm not going to put myself through this if I'm not sure my rights are going to win, right? If there's still going to be a clip. So we have both a lack of knowledge of rights and then a lack of power around the rights. And so we have to remedy both those moments, like awareness of rights, and then how do we make them meaningful in a system that has historically silenced and excluded people?
I think we haven't seen enough system change. I think that is it in a nutshell. I mean, it's a very big nutshell, but there has not been there's been important system change. There has not been enough system change, and it hasn't spread. It's not been broad or deep enough. Victims are still, in many cases, treated very, very poorly. And I would say that a victim being treated well is the exception, not the rule. And you can pretty much look at a victim/survivor's treatment or response from the system and figure out make a pretty good guess without any information about the details of the case, that this is a person who is by and large probably white, sexually assaulted by a stranger, possibly children present, probably married, no previous criminal history. So the perfect acceptable person, for and I would almost always, that's sort of the demographic in the case. Those are the case details. White, typically middle class, sexually assaulted by a stranger, no criminal history.
Wow. And I think that going back to what you said of there has been change, but not enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can definitely see that with the numbers of people coming forward. I had no idea that there wasn't a statistically significant change in reporting, because I know, like, as an educator, I know that we're talking about it more and we're raising more awareness, but there's obviously still this shame and blame around it. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation so we can uplift and raise awareness to victims' rights. So with that, I'd love to start doing that. So what are some specific rights victims have that you would like to highlight on this platform? What do you wish for victims to know?
I would really like survivors to know that they have rights to, and we had to make this happen, but they have right to a forensic exam without reporting to law enforcement. They absolutely have a right. That's a right they have in statute. They have a right to the presence of an advocate from a certified rape crisis center when they get a forensic exam done. They have a right to have, and now, I mean, there has been important change. They processed the backlog in Florida. They made sure that they're not going to languish anymore. They have a right to ensure that kit will be sent to, if they make a law enforcement report, that kit will be sent for processing within 30 days. They still have the right to have the evidence collected if they don't make a law enforcement report, and they can convert to a report at some point whenever they want to. But they also have a right to review the law enforcement report prior to submission, prior to final submission. They have a right to be informed, present, and hear all crucial stages of the criminal or juvenile proceeding in Florida. They have a right to have an advocate present during discovery deposition. They have a right to have identifying information from the criminal investigation kept confidential. In Florida, they have a right to have the offender, if charged, not necessarily convicted, but if charged, tested for HIV and hepatitis. They have a right to attend the sentencing or disposition of the offender, to receive notification of judicial proceedings and scheduling changes, to be notified about the offender's release from incarceration, to request restitution, to give a victim impact statement, not to be subjected to a polygraph exam. So it was I feel I need to say this, that very often law enforcement would say, we'd like to give you a polygraph. And essentially that was a condition of proceeding with the investigation, and law enforcement can no longer do that. And that's been quite some time since they've not been able to do that. To take up to 3 days of leave from work for appointments related to having been assaulted. Now in Florida, the eligible employers have 50 or more employees, and the employee has to be employed for at least 3 months. though employers have been known to grant those without meeting that standard or that threshold, they have a right to apply for an injunction if they fear for their safety, or if the offender is being released, or both. And then also rights to victim crime compensation. So now sexual assault survivors have a right to relocation assistance from the Victims Comp Trust Fund, but it took us more than 10 years to get that, to make that possible. So that's kind of in a nutshell, but then there are also some other things.
I think Jen just listed kind of a lot of the rights, and what I always try and do is put them in like a schema, and so like, how can we remember them? And one of the ones that my agency, the National Crime Victim Law Institute, uses is this idea of the 4 Ps: privacy, protection, participation, and property. That last one doesn't really fit very well because that's about restitution or compensation. It's about like how financially, but it's a way to start to remember. If you think, right, privacy, participation, protection, property, like if you start to think as a survivor, what parts of my life get impacted? Sometimes it's about privacy. Sometimes it's protection or safety. Sometimes it is, I just want to know what's happening, right? And I want to have a voice. And then sometimes it's about, I'm financially hurt by this. How do I get made whole? Those 4 Ps, in every jurisdiction in this country, you can find a right that helps you with each of those. And Jen just listed them, and we could put them in that schema, right? But that's one of the things is every survivor in every jurisdiction in this country has some right that helps them with each of those Ps. And among the ones that I think are so critical, particularly for sexual assault survivors that Jen listed, right, are those that are around privacy and protection. Right? The privacy or confidentiality rights that we have as survivors of crime, and that any victim of crime, and I use both words, survivor and victim. Victim's the legal term of art. Survivor is the word that often is seen as more empowering, and I use them both. Privacy, you don't have it over everything, but over a lot of things you can control who knows what about your life, even when you're engaging in system. Can I keep my name out of it? Can I keep my address out of it? And the answer generally is yes, right, from public consumption. But survivors don't know that. And the system doesn't tell it to them enough. And then we often, survivors are scared, right, about retaliation, about, I love that I'm on a podcast, but they're scared of the media, right? They're scared of all of this. And so there are rights, and Jen listed them, around privacy and protection that are so important for survivors. So I wouldn't add anything specific to what Jen said. I thought she had listed a bunch of the really critical ones.
And I actually really appreciate your putting them in the 4 Ps, because that's really a useful way to think about them. And also when you're trying to remember all of the things, the rights that a survivor has, if you think about them in that way, it's easier to make sure you don't miss any, because advocates have a responsibility and feel deeply the responsibility to make sure survivors know what their rights are and help them access them.
Yeah. I'm going to add one piece, I guess, and it's kind of wacky that I didn't at first because it's my own profession. You actually can have your own lawyer too to protect you and your rights, right? You have a right to have a lawyer. Right. No, it's not paid for counsel, right? It's not counsel that the state pays for, like as if you were an indigent defendant. But there are so many agencies now that have at least some expertise. There are not enough that have expertise in victims' rights, but there are many that do. And Florida certainly has some, and other states have them also. And so you have a right to have an attorney talk to you about your rights and help you understand them so that you can knowingly and voluntarily exercise them. So in addition to the specific rights, you have a right to an attorney.
Right. Absolutely.
I think that's just so important because this process can be so overwhelming, right? And so already the survivor is going through their healing journey, has gone through trauma. It's already an overwhelming time. And so having this on top of it, just knowing your rights is so empowering. And also knowing that you can talk to someone about it too. I love that you did separate it into those P's. It's a lot of information. So I love that thank you so much for highlighting all of that. I think that's super important. with that, you were mentioning kind of like certainly in the state of Florida, and you were kind of mentioning different states and things like that. So do victims' rights vary across the states? And then maybe Jen, later on, maybe you can talk about some specific rights that maybe didn't list in Florida, but it sounds like you listed all of them. But kind of just curious about the difference between victims' rights in the states, if there are any.
Sure. So the starting point of thinking about the entire country is to understand that every state has some victims' rights. 35 states, it may even be 36 at this point, have constitutionalized the rights, meaning that in their state constitution, which is the highest state law, they've put victims' rights in those. And in in every state, they're in statute. So everywhere in the country, there are rights for victims. It just, then you have to dig into what are the exact words? What are they phrased as? And what is the scope of the population that's covered by them? And what I mean by that is every jurisdiction, every state defines victim differently. So we define who gets rights differently. And so sometimes it's only felonies, right? If we're in the criminal justice system, sometimes it's felonies and misdemeanors. That has a huge implication for domestic violence across this country, right? Sometimes the rights are only if you report your crime, right? And sometimes they're not. So there is nuance in every jurisdiction, but every survivor and every person listening to this podcast should know that wherever you are, you have at least some rights. And that's why it's really important to get to an advocate and an attorney to say, and what exactly are those rights for me right now today, so I can choose what to do with them.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate that, Meg. And I know you've got that perspective doing the work across the country. And I think that while I've listed a whole bunch of rights, Emilie, I think I want to point out that many of those rights, not all of them, were really related to the rights of survivors who are engaged in the criminal justice process, the criminal legal system. But we know that that's really only a small percentage of survivors. I mean, it's a significant percentage, but it's not the majority. So even for a victim who doesn't engage in the criminal justice system, civil legal, they have rights related to the civil legal. They have civil legal rights. So particularly protecting the rights their privacy is not just about doing that within the criminal justice system, ensuring that they have safe housing, ensuring that sexual assault, their victimization doesn't interfere with their educational opportunities. And in fact, there's some research that indicates that it really does. It changes people's professional trajectories and their educational trajectories. But ensuring that their rights within, say, an administrative process in the educational system they're protected, or that they have options for continuing their education when it's interrupted by victimization and trauma, and also seeking immigration relief, obtaining protection orders. So those are some other areas that having people who have some expertise in this civil legal remedies for victims of sexual assault is really helpful. And survivors just don't know that that's available.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of highlighting the really, really important roles that victim advocates have and attorneys have in this process, because it's just too much for one person to know. So it's really, I love that victims' rights also kind of uplifts and honors these people that are really doing the work to help these survivors navigate this really difficult system of, after a crime occurs, you have rights. And knowing
in way more arenas than you think you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I am learning so much from both of you. You mentioned kind of immigration, and I wanted to highlight first, this question: do these rights only apply to U.S. citizens? Does it only apply to U.S. citizens and green card holders?
No. And I'm going to be quick about this, but all victims deserve access to justice. Non-citizens and undocumented persons are particularly vulnerable to abuse. So, the attorneys who work on our legal team work with every survivor to ensure safety planning around accessing the system, and do so with awareness of the prejudice that exists in various communities, and have those discussions with clients. So, survivors. So our legal team has seen bailiffs motivated by their own racism or xenophobia call immigration services on undocumented clients who appear in court and report them. I mean, so they have rights, and it's especially important to have, experienced attorneys ensuring that those rights are protected. Yeah.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you highlighting that. It's really important that we do, uplift and acknowledge that there are people who are more at risk for things like,
Absolutely.
Losing their rights and things like that. So it's important that
Absolutely.
you do have rights, and always want to mention too, the VSC is able to provide our services regardless of someone's immigration status as well, because we provide free services. You don't even need to provide our insurance, anything like that. So just want to highlight that too.
I appreciate that. And I want to just say that, give you all a shout out, because I know that you all provide excellent services. I mean, I know that for a fact. I know that you do. And also I want to say that's true, that services are available from rape crisis centers across the state of Florida at no charge.
Again, the starting point of all of this is many of these rights are human rights.
Right.
You have them because you are a human being. And then our civil rights, our victims' rights that are specifically codified, they aren't limited by immigration status. And in fact, we have actually passed some laws that are enhanced protections because we know that there's vulnerability. So certain protections around, if you've been a victim of crime, you might be eligible for certain visas that protect your ability to stay in the country. So, because we recognize vulnerability, do we recognize it enough? And are we disrupting that vulnerability enough? We are not. And that's why it's so important to have accessible services, no cost services, right? Services in multiple languages, services with accessibility for persons with differing abilities, right? We as a victim services community are constantly working to improve our accessibility because we know there's vulnerability, but every human being who is a victim of crime has a right to services to help them move from victim to survivor to thriver. Every human being.
And I think the basic starting point is that we believe in the essential and the dignity and value of every human being. And that's the starting point for all of the work we do. And it has to be.
Yeah, I want to first thank you for the shout out, Jen. And also, I think that that's such an important foundation that we should have. I think that's a great framework that we should all have, that every human being has a right to dignity, and as they move forward through this. I wanted to ask, through your work, were there times when survivors said to you, I wish I knew that before? And if so, could either of you share a specific story, of course, while remaining confidential?
So I can go first. Sadly, I hear it really regularly that I wish I had known, right? I wish I had known that if I reported my crime, that meant that the defendant would know, the accused would know more about me. I wish I had known that if I turned my cell phone over to law enforcement, it would mean that it would become a public record, right? I wish I had known, all of these things. And my examples are often about criminal justice because I work in criminal justice more so. But like a very specific example of that would be a survivor with whom we partnered with an advocate working with the survivor. And they literally they were asked to share their cell phone because there was evidence on their cell phone about text exchanges that would document the abusive behavior of someone who was both verbally, physically abusive and stalking them. And so, right, they had evidence on their cell phone, and law enforcement said, well, can we have your phone? And initially the victim did what I think an advocate had shared with them, which was great. Let's give them screenshots. And then law enforcement said that's not sufficient, which actually it is. But so they turned their cell phone over, and law enforcement dumped their entire phone. And once law enforcement dumped their entire phone, and by dump, I mean they made a copy of it, so they had all the data, then the question becomes how much of all of that goes to the prosecutor and eventually the defendant, because there's laws that govern once investigatory agencies have certain stuff. And the survivor just said, I would never, I didn't want to fight this fight, basically, is what she ended up saying. If only I had known, I would have been able to choose whether to even report the crime. I would have been able to choose what I wanted to share. Do I want my text messages to go? So, I mean, and quite honestly, she might have landed on still turning it over. I will be honest, the conversations we had with her and her advocate, she still might have turned over the phone, but she never had a choice to know what the heck was going to happen when she turned over her phone. And that's the issue, at least from my perspective. The survivor not knowing the outcome of a choice means they never had a choice in the first place. So that's the one. And I'm a very privacy oriented person. And I think when folks don't know what's going to happen to their own narrative, it's really problematic. And this survivor with whom we worked, she just wished she would have known so she could have chosen.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Meg. And I know we've heard stories like that. When I think about what I have typically heard from survivors is, if I had known the criminal justice process was going to be so difficult, or take so long, or that the defense would be granted, 500 continuances, or I would never have reported. I mean, that's the sort of thing that we hear. Or I've never heard anyone say the evidentiary exam was so difficult. It's not that, it's how people are treated within the system. Not those concrete things, but whether they're treated with dignity and respect. That's typically it. Or I have heard a survivor say, I believed the university when they said that I could report and it would be confidential, only to find out that it wasn't. And if I'd known that there were exceptions to that, I would never have reported.
We've heard all of those too, Jen. I would also say that what we have heard quite a bit, once a survivor has made their way to a victim lawyer, we've heard them say, I wish I'd known I could have had a lawyer sooner to understand this.
Absolutely.
Because, there's this cultural belief, I think, that particularly if you are in criminal justice, that somehow the system is looking out for you, that somehow either the prosecutor or someone else in the system is really going to protect your rights. And so a lot of times survivors kind of just go with the flow, or they're compelled by the flow, right? Like they're drug along the system. And then when they finally get someone whose sole job, singular job is to talk with them about what do they want and how do they want to exercise their rights, they breathe very differently. And they say things like, if only I had known, if only I had known I could talk to someone, if only I had known I could have said no. Right.
Right. Yeah, I think what they say is, I didn't know that the prosecuting attorney, or in Florida it would be the state attorney's office, wasn't my attorney. I didn't know that. Well, no, I mean, and that's not a knock on the prosecutors. The fact is that they're representing the state's interest. It's not their job to protect your privacy. It's not their job to do that. But an attorney who's your own attorney can help with that during the process. And I think so many people really believe that that's the prosecutor's job, that the prosecutor represents them, and the prosecution does not. And again, not a criticism of prosecutors. It's just a reality, it's fact.
Yeah, I think that there seems to be a lot of miscommunication, or at least misunderstandings. And I think that I want to uplift again kind of the importance of survivors getting a choice and knowing what their choices are. I think that how can they make a choice if they don't even know what the options are?
Right. Or they don't know what the potential outcomes are.
Yeah.
Risks,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. How can you play with like blind, right? It doesn't make any sense. Especially I want to echo too, I hear a lot from our advocates that survivors, you know, choosing whether or not to report is a big choice.
Right.
And a lot of times it could either, you know, not lead to a conviction, or it could and it's not what they wanted to.
Right.
I've heard that as well. And so it's just important that they have this information that's realistic so they can make that choice and know like it is a long process, but this is what I want for my healing journey. This is what I choose. You know, Meg, you brought up the concept of owning the apostrophe in victims' rights. So could you explain a bit about that and a little bit about the role that empowerment plays here in this conversation?
Sure. So the way we being the National Crime Victim Law Institute, think about victims' rights is you spell it VICTIM apostrophe S, right? And that apostrophe in kind of traditional, English grammar is ownership, right? I'm not talking about the contraction. There's also that part of grammar, but the ownership, I own something. And when someone owns something, someone else can't just do something with that. So if I own my watch, right, you don't get to just take my watch. You have to say, hey, Meg, may I borrow your watch, or my telephone, or whatever it is. So if we think about victims' rights that way, that apostrophe being ownership, then the entire way we approach victims' rights is different, right? Because we have to say to a survivor, oh, you have the right to dignity. What does that mean to you? How would you like me to behave? You have the right to privacy. Oh, I can't just do whatever I want with your name or your story. What would you like me to do? So when we really ground victims' rights in that apostrophe, we have to like ask for permission to do things with the survivor's story. We have to ask for permission. And the survivor gets to be in control, gets to be the boss of certain moments, right? Gets to own certain moments. And that empowerment, that owning, is so critical to kind of returning agency to survivors, because what we know of that, continuum of victim to survivor to thriver, tons of research supports that the more someone has agency, the more someone has control over their own narrative, the more someone has choice, right? The more they can move down that continuum and choose their path of healing. So if we put everything in that apostrophe and actually honor it, we're helping a survivor move out of their immediate post-victimization and kind of craft their new normal.
I want to echo that. I mean, that is really well said, Meg. I think that apostrophe means that all of these rights have suddenly accrued to you, and they are yours now. And I think that's why it's also that's the thing that people don't realize about in a criminal justice system is that they don't have the control, and it's just the nature of the system, right? So, but there are other arenas in which they can have control, and this also it may be a little bit off topic, but I'm not really sure because it means asking people what they want. And that also means asking the survivor, what is justice to that survivor? What does justice look like for that survivor? And I think we should not forget that justice is different for each individual. It means something different. And it also is different in different communities.
Go ahead.
I would add, Jen, too, and Emilie, that it is also really critical that we continue to ask that question, because not only is it different for different people and different communities, it's different for the same person on different days, right? Because we evolve. And I think honoring that survivors have different needs at different moments, and they hope for different things for themselves and their communities and their futures, constantly evolving, that it changes. I think that is so important. So we should be constantly asking, what would help you today? What do you need today? What do you hope for your tomorrow? It's just an ongoing conversation of healing, as opposed to this snapshot of hurt and harm. And if we can think about victims' rights and the apostrophe around that I have to keep checking in with you. I have to keep asking you, what do you want to do with all of this? And what do you hope for? Then we'll have an ongoing conversation that'll help our communities, as opposed to, I think, a harmful approach to victimization.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love both of what you guys are both saying here. And I just want to echo kind of the importance of empowerment and of that agency, because that's the word that I'm hearing when I hear both of you speak, which is so critical for survivors of sexual violence, because it is a crime of power and control. They have had their power taken away from them in that moment. And so giving them that agency, that choice, having them define what justice is to them, having them define what their healing journey looks like to them today too. And I love that concept of it can change. Absolutely, it can change. That makes like complete sense. It can be incredibly healing, and it's necessary, and it's important. And dignity, again, is kind of that foundation that I want to come back to. Before, Jen, you talked about how there's this misconception about how the prosecutor is your attorney if you're a survivor, which is not the case. So I wanted to see if there were some other common myths or misconceptions surrounding this topic that you would like to address.
I think there's a sense that, or a belief that if there's sufficient evidence, cases will move forward, and that there will be convictions. Survivors often believe that because they're supposed to be consulted on any plea agreements, that their opinions about plea agreements will actually determine the outcome. I think those are some of the ones that just occur to me right off the top. I mean, there are lots of misconceptions, but thinking about those are the things that really, in that system, that I'm most at the forefront right now.
I think I would add, in terms of misconceptions, absolutely agree. There's the misconception that the prosecutor is the victim's lawyer. Like, I cannot tell you how many times the survivor has said to me, my lawyer said this. And when I dig in, it's like, oh, that's the prosecutor. That's not your lawyer. And then there's this, I think, general, so not even just a victim misperception, but a generalized cultural misperception that there's this limited pot of rights in the world. And it's all like there. And we start giving them out, right? I give one to Jen, I give one to you, Emilie, I take one, and now the pot's reduced, right? So, oh my gosh, well, if Jen is going to be treated well, let's say as an accused, right, a justice involved individual, if I gave Emilie one, oh my God, that means Jen can't have as many, right? So this notion that it's a zero-sum game, right? Like, if I give you one, Jen loses one. That's just not how rights work, right? They're about an individual human being. Again, it's the contract with the government. How am I going to be treated? And I think that is really fundamentally misperceived, that there's a limited amount of rights and we dole them out to people. It's really that every human being has rights, just by the nature of them being a human being. And then sometimes they have rights because they're accused and they get all those rights. And sometimes they have rights because they're a victim and they get all those rights, and those don't conflict. They just both get them. And I think that's really important, because my rights as a victim are not rights that hurt the defendant. They're rights that say how the system is supposed to treat me.
Right. And there may be conflict about how those things get negotiated. And very often people will say, oh, well, this victim's right, if you're considering a particular adding a victim's right to statute or to the state constitution, this is going to mean that defendants don't get their rights. And that's not how it works, right? The state has an obligation to protect both. It's like there's not a limited pot of dignity, right? There's not a limited, I don't have a limited, love isn't limited. Being respectful to people, I don't have a limited capacity, a limited amount of respect to give to people I engage with on a daily basis.
Yeah, I don't think we can run out of those things. And I want to just echo that, because I think that's such an important concept that we can apply to a lot of different things, I think. but especially for this conversation too.
No, I mean, I think, and wanting a right doesn't mean you want to take something from someone else.
Right.
It's not a tug of war.
Mm-hmm.
Asserting a right is not, taking a scoop, taking somebody a scoop of ice cream from somebody who's got two. It's just not what it is.
Just not how it works. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that there was this other misconception that we were talking about before, which is, offline, which is if you are pro victims' rights, then you are against criminal justice reform. So I didn't know if either of you wanted to speak to this misconception too.
I actually want to address that particular thing about that, if you'll allow me. Go back to think about the comment where I said, well, we need to ask survivors what justice means to them, right? So do you know how often, especially children, don't report child sexual abuse? It's not just because they don't think somebody's going to believe them. It's because they also believe that this person they love who is doing this terrible thing to them is going to go to prison for the rest of his or her life. And they don't want that. They don't want that. It doesn't mean they don't want it to stop. It doesn't mean they don't want there to be consequences, but they don't want that. And so, and some do, but some don't. And especially when you're talking about, you look at college, say sexual assault in an institution of higher education in college. You're talking about people who are most often sexually assaulted by somebody in their social circle. And they want something done, and they want acknowledgement, and they want accountability. But many of them don't think of accountability as a 20-year sentence. So I think that there are lots of people who are very supportive of victims' rights, who are also supportive of criminal justice reform, because overall, many people want a more just society, and then accountability and justice doesn't look one particular way.
I would add to that too, right? At its core, right, criminal justice reform is about ensuring that we have systems that treat people humanely and with dignity,
right,
and that we honor and recognize that when we use certain tools, we actually create more harm in our community. Right, that's the fundamental premise of criminal justice reform. Let's reform in a way that improves our communities and hurts people less. Right, victims' rights are about humane and dignified treatment of individual human beings. They happen to be the victim of the crime as opposed to the accused of the crime, but the fundamental premise of criminal justice reform and victims' rights is identical. Dignified, humane treatment of individual human beings who are swept up in criminal justice. And so, in fact, if we can talk in a way that allows us to focus on all the human beings impacted by crime in the same conversation and honor their difference, right? The difference of what they want, what they need, where they come from, will reform in a really positive way that honors differences. And if we leave anyone out of that conversation, we have a problem. Like, we're not going to reach true reform.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, I think that can always be said more and more about like intersectionality and things like that. If there's anyone who's left out of the conversation, it really isn't justice, right? That makes complete sense. Mm-hmm. I also, kind of shifting here a little bit, I wanted to know these rights that we're talking about, that we've been highlighting. Are these rights always protected through legislation?
Well, as a lawyer, I'm always looking at the law, right? So I am looking at what is in law and what can I do with that. And then when I see a gap, then my job as a lawyer is to get to the legislature and try to fill the gap with a better law, right? So as a lawyer, that's like that's my biggest tool as a lawyer is to look at the law, find what's there to protect a human being and leverage it. And if there's a gap, then to go back and try to work on new legislation, right? Or new policy provisions or something. So I'm always looking for words on paper that I can use. And so that's my bailiwick is that's the tool that I use most. Jen may have some other ideas.
I would say the law is the tool.
Yeah, and I guess my question can also be worded in a sense that can we always expect that they will be upheld? You know, are they like
no.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you phrase it, are the rights that are in law always protected? The answer is no.
No.
And this is one of the challenges or misconceptions that I think is out there. People think that if it's written into law, of course, everyone will abide by it. And that is simply not what happens. It's not what happens for accused, right? Their rights. It certainly isn't what happens with victims' rights. In part, victims' rights are so darn new in law. I mean, we might think that having them in law for 4 decades is a long time, but when it comes to law, that is a microsecond, right? Like it's this really short time. So tons of judges on the bench, they went to law school before victims' rights existed. Right. So they're not going to be protected because they're not normalized yet. They're not part of our conversation yet. They're not just routinized. It's not like they're not ordinary. So this is why we have to be so vigilant. This is why we need advocates. This is why we need victims' rights attorneys. This is why we need a Know Your Rights campaign, because we have to get to the place where we all know our rights, we all ask for them, and we all call each other out when we violate them in a good way, right? I shouldn't say call each other out, call each other in, right? But elevate it. Let's improve systems. Let's get better.
And that's really actually one of the reasons that there's been a development of basically civil legal representation for sexual assault survivors is really ensuring that they can access those rights and that they know what they are, and that when they're being violated, they've got an attorney representing them and demanding that those rights are respected and upheld. And that's really, I mean, I see that as kind of an extension of what we started with around advocacy. So people can, an advocate and a private attorney or an attorney in a civil, a legal aid organization that does this and has skill in it, work together to ensure that a survivor has his or her rights or their rights. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, so I appreciate you both kind of sharing that. And again, always highlighting the important work that everyone's doing, honestly.
I'd actually like to tell a story about this. I told this to you when we were talking, is that remember when for some reason, I cannot remember which reauthorization of VAWA it was, but it was one of the reauthorizations of VAWA that said, that required, with the stop formula grant, states in order to continue to get the stop formula grant, had to allow victims to get forensic exams without reporting to law enforcement. And prior to that reauthorization, you couldn't, if a survivor had to have the payment for that exam happened only if law enforcement signed off on the form and it went to the AG's office. And if a law enforcement officer didn't believe the survivor, the law enforcement officer could not sign the form. And then the survivor could get charged for that exam. So this was when VAWA was reauthorized. That was a big legislative priority for us immediately in the next session. And then when the law passed, actually we had a lot of great champions in the legislature, and it was not a problem. But then we had to talk about implementation at the local level. So we put this statewide work group together, and we had some great folks on that. We also had conversations. We had victim advocates from, system-based victim advocates, law enforcement-based victim advocates, and we had community-based victim advocates from rape crisis centers, and we had, FDLE lab folks and all of that, talking about what would implementation look like. And there were communities in which victim advocates from the local certified rape crisis center were not called out to forensic exams because historically law enforcement victim advocates had gone. But if you have a non-reporting survivor, that is completely not appropriate. You should not have a law enforcement victim advocate. And that conversation is not privileged. So we were having these conversations about, and there was a lot of pushback because folks were, people who were used to going out to forensic exams and providing advocacy from law enforcement, really were very distressed and said, well, they don't, we'd say, well, they have to have, they also have a right to a victim advocate at that point we've made from a local certified rape crisis center. And they would say, well, they don't know what their rights are if we don't tell them. They'd say, we don't have to tell them, right? Nobody has to tell them what the rights are. And we said, you're exactly making the point here, right? But that was actually, and we really had to say, your role is incredibly important. Unfortunately, there are more survivors, more than enough to go around. There's more than enough work for all of us, but it really is important that a survivor who doesn't want to report or may want to report but isn't sure whether she wants to report or he wants to report right now doesn't have to deal with somebody from a law enforcement agency during the forensic exam.
Jen, related to the start of that, like the VAWA reauthorization and the part about that is about the not having to pay for your own. Right. And Emilie, to your question of are the rights that are in law always protected? Literally yesterday, so this month, April 2021, a story comes out in Oregon. A rape victim in Oregon was asked to pay for her own rape kit exam.
Yep.
Totally against the law.
Right.
And so, and thank goodness the survivor ended up being able to navigate to a wonderful victim lawyer who figured it out what was going on and is challenging it. But how many survivors are having their rights violated and aren't being told that they ever had the rights, and they're getting this additional victimization because we aren't activating their rights in a meaningful way. I mean, it's just astounding to me. Everyone would have thought that was fixed.
Our staff attorneys still are writing letters to hospital billing departments, you know? Yeah. I mean, it's much better. Yeah. It's much better. And there's been a lot of progress, but still.
Wow.
We exist for those cases. That's why we do this work.
Yeah, and I appreciate you both kind of highlighting the re-victimization piece to it. Again, just highlighting how important the dignity is and how important power and control is here. You talked about the VAWA changes. So I wanted to know if you had any other changes to victims' rights that have happened over the course of your careers. It sounds like victim rights is relatively new as well, which I didn't realize it was new enough where there are judges sitting that they didn't exist before. But I didn't know if you had any other changes to victims' rights that you wanted to highlight.
And I think in Florida for us, the significant ones have been, the around specific victims' rights. So the right to a forensic exam without a report to law enforcement was huge. The right to have a victim advocate from a certified rape crisis center present was huge. The access to relocation assistance was incredibly important. And I think, obviously there have been a number of them, a number of significant changes from my perspective in the last 15 to 18 years. I think we'll see more, and certainly Meg, you've seen.
Yeah. So I started at NCVLI in 2003, and which is both a long time ago and not really in many ways, right? In 2004, we helped pass the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act. So since I've been doing this exact job, we finally got federal victims' rights. Right? Like they didn't exist before that. And in the last handful of years, so starting in 2008, states started reflecting on how strong their rights were, particularly around protections in criminal justice. And starting in 2008, states started to re-amend their constitutions, California and Oregon being the first, California is being labeled Marsy's Law, which is the same title as Florida. Oregon didn't name ours that, ours is different. But folks started to look at their constitutions and to see, could we fill in some gaps, right? Like, could we make them stronger? So since I've been doing this work folks have reflected on their laws and said, those laws that we first passed in the 80s, are they fulfilling the promise of helping reduce re-victimization, right? And a lot of jurisdictions have said, no, the laws aren't fulfilling that promise of reducing re-victimization from engagement and system. So let's fix law. That's one thing that's changed, is trying to fix law. And the way that they've been doing that is to say, make sure that the law puts that apostrophe in. Make sure the law gives it to the victim and allows them to have their own lawyer, right? Allows them to have their own voice, allows them to choose. So when you look at the changes in some of the laws that have happened, particularly over the last 20 years, and then really since 2008 forward, you can break all of that down to the changes in those laws are about that apostrophe, giving the victim the right to counsel, albeit not paid, giving them the right to do something with their own rights. And I would say, my first years on the job, the idea of a victim having their own lawyer in a criminal case was not only not understood, but people found it appalling. Like, what are you doing? Why are you here? The equivalent of shut up, sit down. And now I would not say it's been normalized, but there are a lot of places where it's much more common, and it's becoming more common, including, and this is something I think for your audience to know, military victims have equivalent rights also. So the military justice system modified its laws a handful of years ago to model what's happening under the federal law. And so they have what are known as Article 6B rights. They're just like victims' rights, very similar to the constitutional rights that exist in Florida, very similar to the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act. And so people who are victimized while they're members of the military or by a military member who is going through a court-martial process or another adjudication in the military also have rights, and they have right to counsel.
Wow, I think it's so important that we see that these changes are happening, and kind of going off of that, what could we be doing better as a society in regards to victims' rights?
I don't know if you have enough time.
That's fair.
I mean, no, I think there has been a lot of progress. I think we're going to see a lot more change in the military. I think that's probably coming. I don't know what that will look like, but I think, we've seen there continue to be a lot of reports about difficulties in the command structure and people not being believed and harassment not being taken seriously and interventions not being done and people dying. And so I think we're going to see some more changes. I think this is a groundswell that is not going to slow down. So one of the things I do want to mention that I think was a fairly recent change and an important one, actually we did it 5 years ago, was if a victim conceives and delivers a child as the consequence of a sexual assault, that survivor can petition to terminate the offender's parental rights, which is huge. And Florida has been always has a very strong parents' rights and not just parents, fathers' rights laws, and that was a big one, and it's particularly important. And I think we'll see more. I think we'll see rights laws passed that we don't even imagine what they are yet.
Going to your question, Emilie, I totally agree with what Jen just said, particularly about that we can't even imagine. Going to what can we do better? This conversation that you're hosting, I'm really grateful for, right? Because these conversations need to happen. And they need to happen from a premise too of it is okay to have been victimized, right? That is not a bad word that you're a victim. We can find power for you again, and you can find your own power again. And we're going to start it all by believing you, right? So things we can do, have conversations, start by believing people, start by disrupting conversations that minimize victimization, right? All these moments where what we do is we start creating a culture of, oh my gosh, you've been harmed. How can I help? Right? And you know what? One of the ways I can help is by having a conversation about your rights. Like, we can all know our rights. We can all start to recite them. And if we do that, our conversations will shift and we'll start re-injecting power much more quickly to survivors. So I think there's a lot we can do that's really low-hanging fruit. Let's just talk about it, and talk about it without shame, without blame, and just saying, how can I help? And did you know you have rights?
Right. And I think also doing that and holding systems accountable for failure to uphold and protect victims' rights. Because what happens is that survivors have rights, and and when they know about those rights, sometimes the power of the system, the weight of the system, say, if they're working in their employment, in their work environment, keeps prevents them from accessing those rights, or the cost feels too great. And when we don't hold those systems accountable, and we don't demand as a community and culture that they do better, then we're complicit in that. And that's one of the reasons these conversations are so important, is because as long as we keep having them, things will have to change. I mean, we're going to keep having them, and we're going to talk about that, and talk about this issue without shame, and demand that people and institutions be accountable.
Absolutely. And I think that there are like little things that we can do, like you mentioned, Meg and Jen, of just supporting survivors and starting by believing and removing that shame, because then more and more people will share their story. And we are seeing like changes already happening in legislation, like right now, even. I want to uplift Gail's law that's going and like kind of happening right now. Gail is one of our Speakers Bureau members who's a survivor, and she's actually looking right now to have it so that there is a database for rape kits, and that will have to be maintained, and then it'll update survivors, and they'll have access to it as far as like the processing and where it is in the system and things like that. So just want to uplift that too, and show that always like gives me a sense of hope, I think, like seeing it's happening now, right? So I really want to I appreciate what everyone's doing.
Yeah, the rape kit tracking bill. And I think what's interesting is that people don't realize that there are so many survivors, and that overwhelmingly changes have come because of the work of survivors, whether they're publicly acknowledged as survivors, or they acknowledge themselves that way publicly or not. This is where this started, is survivors knowing that it needed to be different.
I think, again, we were talking a lot about it's really important that, people are more aware of the rights that they have. So where can someone go to learn more about their rights as a victim of a crime?
In Florida, you can go to our website, www.fcasv.org, and there's a whole bunch of information about your rights there. You can also download a brochure about what your rights are, and you can actually access our civil legal services from the website. So most of that information is available on our website, and it's a great resource. It's going to have a slightly different look pretty soon. We're completely revamping it. And you can't find it, give us a call and we'll make sure you have it. You can call us at 850-297-2000, and we will send you the information and connect you with the people you need.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. And I'll definitely put the phone number and the website in the link in the description for anyone listening.
Thanks.
And I would say for survivors outside of Florida, you can find some information on NCBLI's website, which is www.ncbli.org, National Crime Victim Law Institute.org. And we'll point you to local resources, because your best option is going to be to find someone in your community with whom to speak. But we can get you started on that path.
Wonderful, wonderful. And, before, I go ahead and sign off here, I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to bring up that we might not have mentioned, or if there's anything you'd like to say to any survivors listening.
I want to say to everybody, there's joy in doing this work. People will say, when they find out what I do, they'll say, "Oh, that is so hard. That's such hard work, and I don't know how you do that." Yeah, you know what? There's joy in doing this work. It's hard work, but it's meaningful work, and it makes a difference in people's lives. What Meg does makes a difference in people's lives. Our staff make a difference in people's lives. The people at VSC make a difference in people's lives. And there's joy in doing this work and in seeing the change. And there's joy in having the conversation.
I love that so much, Jen. I experience the same thing, and I say I have the best job in the world. I have the best job in the world, and part of that's observing human resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Resilience is infectious,
Yeah.
right? We talk about vicarious trauma a ton. We fail to talk about vicarious resilience. Right. And so being around survivors is this beautiful thing where you're watching someone navigate hardship, and you get to be around survival. And that's just beautiful. And so to any survivor who's listening, one of the things I want to say is we see you and we hear you,
Right.
and really we feel you, because you're helping me survive. Right? You're helping me be more human. And it is absolutely beautiful, because every day you're choosing a different way of surviving. And no matter what you're doing that day, you're surviving. And that is just utterly beautiful. And so I'm just grateful. I'm just truly grateful for the work, for survivors, with all the colleagues they get to work with. And my only hope is that in the future that we really give more space to survivor voices.
Right. I want to say, the message that I want to send to survivors is you are not a burden. You are not a burden. Your need for assistance, your reaching out to us, you are not a burden.
I love this. I think that is a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you so much for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Jen and Meg, for joining me today.
Thank you, Emilie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.